Good morning. I am George Udvarhelyi, Professor Emeritus of Neurosurgery at the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. Today is the 21st of April, 1992, and we are sitting in the TV studio of the medical school. And I have the pleasure and the privilege to interview today Dr. Vernon Mountcastle, Professor of Neuroscience here at Hopkins. This interview is part of a series organized by the American Association of Neurosurgical Surgeons to create an archive of videotape of outstanding neurosurgeons and neuroscientists. As Dr. Mountcastle is member of the American Association of Neurosurgical Surgeons, he qualifies both ways. So we will start, and we'll ask Vernon if he would say a few words, perhaps about his background, childhood, and the early education in Roanoke, Virginia, where he comes from.
Well, I am a Virginian, but actually my early education began in the mountains of West Virginia and Kentucky. My father was then a railroad contractor, and my mother subscribed to the Calvert School home instruction course for my two older sisters. And so I began my education at 2 when she was teaching them 4 and 6. So by the time we returned to Roanoke when I was 4, I could read and write. So I got a very fast start in the public schools of Roanoke. There I went through school, ending up in 1935 from the Roanoke Public High School. And from there was the depths of the Depression. So I lived at home and went to Roanoke College, and I was very lucky to have Roanoke College. It was only 6 miles away. And it was and still is. I'm very proud of being a graduate of it. It's a wonderful, small, liberal arts college. In my class there, when I graduated, there were 52 people. And because it was the Depression, I suppose jobs were hard to get, they had an extraordinary array of wonderful teachers. In most of my classes, there were only 5 or 7 people. And I remember many of those teachers now with great affection and admiration, because they gave me the opportunity to study independently, to do things that I wanted to do. And at the end of that time, 1935, it was suggested to me by my professor of chemistry that I apply to Johns Hopkins. It had never crossed my mind prior to that. He had a PhD in chemistry from Hopkins, and I did without any idea that I would be admitted. And I was admitted and received the letter on Christmas Eve. And my mother responded by saying, "Vernon, you can't go up to school with all those Yankees."
But you decided to go to medicine?
I decided on medicine fairly early in my life, and exactly why, I don't know. I did consider other occupations from time to time. I was very much interested at one time in chemistry per se, and I had applied for a job at the DuPont and gotten it. I was thinking that I might not get into medical school. That interest arose very early, and I participated in lots of activities as a child which led to medicine. There were no doctors in my family. My family all are southern farmers, my father a railroad contractor, so there was no scientist and no professional people in my family prior to me.
But I remember you had a great affection for your father.
Well, my father and my mother were tremendous influences on me. My mother had been a teacher, and consequently she treated us as students in the home each night. We repeated our lessons to my mother, and if they weren't right, you did them over again. My father spent his life helping other people in this large family of 5 children, and we all owe to him everything.
But it shows you that the real education starts
at home. It certainly did for me.
Well, so when you came to Hopkins, to the medical school, when you got the letter, what was your impression of this institution?
Well, it was a fantastic experience for me. I have to confess to you, George, that before coming to Hopkins, I had never been north of Charlottesville. And someone asked me the other day, why not? And I said, why? What was there? But at any rate, I arrived and got on the train, the Birmingham Southern, and arrived here in company with a classmate whom I met on the train. And it was a fantastic experience because Hopkins was then poor and struggling through the Depression, but we were accepted as fellow scholars by our teachers in the basic sciences. And
of course, it was much smaller.
It was much smaller. There were 75 people in the class. And our entry was into anatomy, and there was a very great department of anatomy at that time. headed by Lewis Weed, who was already involved in national affairs in the war, but his staff was fantastic. There were two physical anthropologists, Adolf Schultz and William Strauss. And of course the people that influenced me most were two great women, neuroanatomists, Marion Hines and Sarah Tower.
Yeah.
And the teaching was extraordinary. Each of those ladies, we had neuroanatomy several afternoons a week, and they took the time to sit by on a stool by you at the microscope and teach you how to look and how to see. And that was an extraordinary experience for me. The other teachers in the basic sciences were equally important, Clark in biochemistry and Bard in physiology. And I suppose every medical student who came through Hopkins in those years remembers Phillip Bard with great affection and admiration. He had an influence on people which I came close to later, which was extraordinary. It was a sort of an envelope of goodwill which surrounded him, and if you got within that envelope,
Yes.
you had a good feeling, and that had a great influence on students. And Bard thought that all teaching should be personal. So the most senior people taught in the laboratory, including Phillip Bard himself and 2 or 3 students around an experiment.
Well, I have a great respect for Phillip Bard. As you know, I had the pleasure to meet him only when I came here in 1955, but he had the same qualities,
Yes.
the personal approach and outspoken.
Now, I have to say that at that time, the emphasis in the School of Medicine was largely on clinical medicine and surgery, and it never crossed my mind that I would ever be a scientist.
That's interesting.
I was dedicated to medicine and surgery from the moment I came here.
Anybody else influence you on a clinical level in those
Well,
days? As
the
teachers?
tremendous influence on me, of course, was the Department of Surgery and Dr. Blaylock's advent here when I was a junior. His advent was an explosion into the old Dean Lewis concept of surgery. But prior to that, I have to say that a great influence on me and most of my colleagues was Arnold Rich in pathology.
That was it.
Arnold Rich was one of the best brains Hopkins ever had, and he taught us critical ways of thinking about pathology and about disease processes. So he was a tremendous influence as well. Dr. Longcope in medicine was an austere figure, a father figure of tremendous distinction, and he demanded, I suppose that the quarter I spent on medicine, on Osler 4, as a fourth-year student, was the most intensive learning experience I ever had. The visiting man was Maxwell Wintrobe, who was then training himself to be a professor of medicine, and Phil Tumulty was the assistant resident. And there were 2 interns and 5 medical students and 25 patients. And we were there incessantly from morning till morning.
Great teaching.
Great teaching.
That's right.
Bedside teaching.
Well, but anyhow, I had the impression that Dr. Blaylock and the surgical department had great influence on you, because then you applied for surgical internship. Is that right?
Yes,
and
I
not
did.
only that, I remember you telling me that was the time that Dr. Dandy was the neurosurgeon. So you may say a few words about that.
Well, Dr. Dandy was in the apogee of his career. He was then 58 or 59, or younger. He died in 1946 at 60, I think.
Yeah.
So he was in his early 50s.
Yeah.
And he was a distant figure. We were all scared to death of him. Everybody was afraid of Walter Dandy. And I don't know exactly why. But he had a magic about him. You know, Frank Ford said once that God whispers in his ear in making diagnoses. And neurosurgery, as Dandy did it, was a very glamorous thing. I know now that he was a little behind the times. He was a little behind the development of the Penfield, the Cushing-Penfield approach to neurosurgery. But he had developed ways for doing neurosurgeries in extremely difficult situations, and he did them well.
Yes, his intuitiveness was extraordinary.
And his manual dexterity was beyond belief. So we were all, I and a number of other people, are very much taken with neurology and neurosurgery. Neurology virtually didn't exist except in the body of Frank Ford.
Correct.
But he as a teacher was extraordinary too. Medicine was a small subdivision of the department. Neurology was a small subdivision of the Department of Medicine, and Frank Ford and Othello Langworthy were it. But between them and Dandy, they created an interest in the nervous system in many of us, which I never lost. And I suppose it was Dandy's death which turned me into science as much as anything else, because after the war I came back. I heard of his death in April '46.
Yeah, you went away for the...
I went away for the war, and I didn't get out of the Navy until July '46, and I was absolutely distraught because I had hopes of returning to Hopkins and training with Dr. Dandy.
As a neurosurgeon?
Yeah, that was my ambition. Well, my whole future was up for grabs at that time.
Well, then you have to tell us a little bit how Dr. Bard succeeded to seduce you.
Well,
to neurophysiology.
I came back to Hopkins and I saw Dr. Blaylock, and he said, I'm looking for an appointment in neurosurgery and I can make no appointments to the resident staff. So I went to see Barnes Woodall, whom I knew of, I'd never met. Mm-hmm. And I went to Duke and I interviewed Barnes Woodall, asking him for his residency. And we talked for a few moments, and then I said to him, what do you think if I would spend a year with Dr. Bard first? And you probably, if you know Barnes Woodall, you know that he was about 5'3". Yeah. And he jumped up out of his chair and came around his desk and tapped me on the chest, and he said, Mountcastle, he said, if Bard will have you around for a year, you can have my residency. So I got on the train for Baltimore and interviewed Dr. Bard on a hot August afternoon. I was in a tight naval uniform. He had come in to see me. And we sat in his office, and he knew I'd been in the Navy, and he said, and I asked him if I could come as a fellow. And he said, what do you think about motion sickness? Do you think there's any psychosomatic aspect to motion sickness? And I said, absolutely not. He said, come in September. and then I said, well, I couldn't believe it. So I said, well, perhaps you'd better write me a letter. No letter. He hated to write letters. Yeah. Just come in September. So I did. And that was my entry. And I think that, he had worked on motion sickness during the war, and he was so convinced that the psychosomatic aspect of it was very much exaggerated, that my answer hit him right between the eyes.
Yeah, wonderful. That is true. He told this story, how he came to Hopkins, only published 8 papers.
That's right.
That's all. And he wanted a guarantee that nobody will oblige him to write papers if he has nothing to say. Wonderful statement. Well, you have been very lucky then, so you went to Dr. Bard.
So I came into physiology, as a resident fellow in physiology for 2 years, always with the expectation of returning to surgery, which at the end of 2 years I did temporarily with Dr. Walker.
You still did, yeah?
But I was really waiting for a job to open in physiology, and Chandler Brooks left. Mm-hmm. And immediately a job became open, and Dr. Walker very kindly let me go. So I spent a month as Walker's fellow with him, seeing his practice. I'll say something more about that later. Yeah. But perhaps I should talk about what physiology was like at that time.
In those days, yeah.
The methods were relatively crude. They included the electroencephalogram, the evoked potential method, and the lesion method. And each of these had its handicap. The electroencephalographic technique was used elsewhere very productively, as you know, by people like Magoon and Maruzzi in studying sleep and wakefulness. The evoked potential method in the hands of Woolsey and his colleagues and those who followed them was essentially an anatomical method, an important one, and the maps which they produced are still useful. But it really led to no understanding of physiology. Now, the lesion method which Dr. Bard used, and which I worked with him on for several years, had the handicap that he was using it before the development of quantitative methods for measuring behavior and changes in behavior. So each of these methods had its handicap.
You are referring to his hypothalamic studies, basically.
In general, to his lesion work. He did a great deal of lesion work on the motor system and the sensory system, the study of the hopping and placing reactions. And he learned a great deal about them, but what he learned was essentially anatomical. So I began to work in electrophysiology, and I had the most wonderful experience. I was allowed to work for 6 years without being asked to get any money, without being told you should publish something. So essentially I taught myself neurophysiology.
You didn't go anywhere else?
I didn't go anywhere else.
You did it on your...
I did an experiment every day. I learned to do experiments like Dave Lloyd's spinal cord experiment. And then finally we took up the method of single unit analysis, and that was a sudden sea change for us.
When did that happen, roughly?
Well, I did my first experiment with microelectrodes in 1949. 49. Published the first paper in 1954.
And how was this transition perceived by Dr. Bard?
Oh, he was all for it.
All for it.
Oh, yes. Yeah. We received a great deal of information and technique from Bob Galambus, who was then working at Harvard in the acoustic laboratory. And he had done earlier work on the auditory system using the microelectrode method. So Jersey Rose and I took it up working on the thalamus of the cat. And after we finished that, we separated, and I began to work on the cat cerebral cortex in about 1952. And from then I used that method for many years and still do. And the developments of the method have been important.
When you are talking about that, maybe it's time here to say a few words how the ideas developed in your own brain which led to the revolution of neurophysiological technique, but more than technique, concept.
Well, I will in just a moment,
Yeah.
but I would like to say just a couple more words about the atmosphere at Hopkins.
Okay.
I hadn't been in the laboratory 6 months before I realized that the dean knew I was there, that the professor of biochemistry knew I was there, that E.K. Marshall knew I was there. And then I had what is the most extraordinary experience I think a young man can have. I discovered that those people and Dr. Bard thought that I was a lot better than I thought I was. Now that is a very great stimulus. It also is a great responsibility.
Yeah.
And I'd like to say a little bit more about how Bard treated a young man. He never attempted to teach me anything directly. And he gave me what I think is the gift from the gods. That is, a young man needs confidence that he can discover something. Imagine a young man thrown into a lab, now discover something. That's a hell of a job. But Bard gave us all the confidence that we could do it. And he exuded this confidence and goodwill and happiness. He just assumed that we could do it. So we tried to live up to his assumptions.
Well, that is really a very
that had a tremendous influence on me.
Yeah.
After that, I always knew, and I know now, that I can discover something. And that's a very important aspect of self-confidence in science.
To let you go. But basically, this is the problem with children and parents. The best that parents can give, to let the children fly.
Let them go, let them fly.
And it's interesting you mentioned, because I had the privilege to work with Norman Dodd, who was very friendly with Dr. Bard. They visited each other, very similar personalities. Dodd never taught you anything directly, just by example.
That's right. Yeah.
Watching you, and then putting you there.
Exactly.
And watch you from behind. And if he was satisfied,
it's a very wonderful method.
Wonderful time.
Well, the revolution in neurophysiology began with the method of single unit analysis and reached its culmination, I think, with the development of the combined experiment. In the beginning, it was used to reconstruct the population events that occur in the sensory system when a stimulus is delivered. That sounds simple, but it's a very complex problem.
You mean the critical mass?
The critical mass, that is, to reconstruct population events. So I always think that the word single neural analysis is the wrong description of the method. But using it, I was able to define the functional properties of cells in the somatic afferent system, and from that to deduce the concept of the columnar organization of the cortex. Believe it or not, at that time I had not read Louis Deneau's chapter in Fulton's book in which he talks about vertical organization. And it's very interesting how that came out, George. It came out from a persistent tabulation of the data, an inspection of the data, of the characteristics of cells encountered in penetration through the cortex, without any preconceived idea at all. And then I had that bombshell insight. Suddenly, it just appeared, my goodness, these properties are all the same from top to bottom. And it was just by graphing the data and looking at the data over and over again that came out. Then, of course, I could elaborate it in many ways.
Well, I remember that we may have a little break for a few seconds after that, but I remember that Sir John Eccles summarized sort of your contributions to neurophysiology. And for those of the people who don't know that, may I just mention these 4 items and what you are saying about it. The organization of the sensory system and cerebral cortex. Second, the neural mechanism of information processing in sensory systems. And 3, the causal relation between neural events in sensory system of primates and their sensory capacities. And finally, the cortical mechanism of perception. And
he's very kind.
well, but I think he did that very well, I thought. And these 4 items, how did they develop? And before we have a little break, I remember just one thing which I would like to recall, really, because I do remember you came over several times to the Department of Neurosurgery asking for case histories and just listening to the input of patients who had parietal lobe lesions, whatever it was, and just watching them and listening a little bit to the resident and to us and taking away the chart. That was that. We never heard again what happened, but evidently that was...
Well, I learned a lot from that.
Yeah.
I learned a lot about disorders of humans with lesions of the association cortex, but I learned something else. That is that clinical research is much more difficult than basic research.
Well, you are
much
very
more
kind. You are very kind
much
now.
more difficult. Because what you deal with is amorphous and difficult to judge and difficult to deal with. I learned that very quickly.
We have been talking about your scientific contribution, and I quoted a little summary from Sir John Eccles. But probably it would be better if you tell us what you think exactly, what you consider the best.
Well, let me return to the columnar organization business first. I had 2 colleagues in that work, and we decided to divide the work into 2 papers, and they didn't want to put their names on the second paper, which described columnar organization, so it actually has my name only. And the reason is it was such a radical idea that people didn't believe it. My dear colleague Jersey Rose tried to persuade me not to publish it. And it received a lot of criticism. So after I published that paper in 1957, I took up the same problem in the monkey with Tom Powell, who came here in the and published those papers in 1959. And after that, I didn't work on it. Unfortunately for me, Hubel and Wiesel picked it up and, of course, made great discoveries on the columnar organization of the visual cortex. But after that, I gradually moved into the idea that one could seek a direct correlation between measurements of sensory performance and neural events. And I first did that over a number of years by independently studying psychophysics and neurophysiology and correlating the 2. Culminating finally in what I think is the most important thing for me that I did was to show that one can do this simultaneously in a trained, waking, non-human primate. And of course that technique dominates all of central nervous system physiology in the world now. Now, here I would like to make a comment about the importance of colleagues. Because I was so fortunate in all my career that most of the postdoctoral fellows who came to work with me were already mature and accomplished investigators. For example, I learned about psychophysics from Hans Kornhuber, who came from Germany, who knew everything about the history of German psychophysics. And it was because of Kornhuber that I was to take up psychophysics and to translate it into a psychophysics of monkey sensory performance. And Tom Powell, of course, is another one, and Darian Smith, and Miguel Covian. These are people who came as colleagues, not as students. And I would say that at least half of the postdoctoral fellows I've had have been people with that degree of experience. It was very important to me. And
I noticed that indeed you had 49 postdoctoral fellows in neurophysiology, and it seems to me that you have been giving them a total of 89 years of training, which is a wonderful
But about half of those people were very mature and are now professors of neurology and neurosurgery and physiology. Yes. So I was the benefactor, very much so. And they meant a great deal to me in my career. Now, after working on the columnar organization in the monkey and moving on to psychophysics as a correlative technique and then to the simultaneous experiment, I decided, as you know, to make a big adventure. That is, the question which arose is it possible to study the higher functions of the brain with this method?
Correct.
So I began to look around in the clinical neurological literature, and as you know, one of the most striking things that one can find is the parietal lobe syndrome. And you're perfectly right that I went to the hospital and I got out all the histories of the people with parietal lobe syndrome, and I used to go over and look at them. And I remember that McCann showed me a man, a classical case. He was about a 45-year-old man with a stroke who actually complained that somebody had put his arm in bed with him. I didn't believe that statement in the literature till I saw it. Mm-hmm. But the other interesting thing about that case is that I kept an eye on him. And a year later, you could scarcely bring out the defect. Now, that was very startling to me, and I think it's very important for the future of neuroscience and the neurological sciences to develop to discover how we can accelerate and improve this capacity for recovery of function in the brain.
That's correct, the reconstitution.
It's an amazing and difficult question. So then I devised tests in animals which would bring out some of the positive aspects of the defects seen in the parietal lobe syndrome. That is, to measure the degree of attention, to measure visual spatial perception, and to measure visual guidance of reaching of the hand. And I was able to show that in the parietal lobe there are populations of cells which by their properties appear to be the positive image of the parietal lobe syndrome. Now the parietal lobe syndrome in the monkey is a little bit different from that in man, but it's sufficiently identical so that one could say the monkey does have a parietal lobe syndrome. I preceded that by a long series of experiments with lesions in the parietal lobe, producing the parietal lobe syndrome in monkeys, and reviewing the complex and difficult anatomy of the system. And I had a host of people working with me during those years, and that was very exciting. Finally, I abandoned that a few years ago. You know, one of the exciting things about research is to do something new. And you mentioned a little while ago about having fun in research, and I've had fun all my life. And I think to be successful in research, you have to retain some of the playfulness of childhood, to play with ideas, to let them bounce around. And the most important thing that I think, the second most important thing would be to accept willingly and gratefully the criticisms of your colleagues.
Well,
now that's difficult, but it's extremely important to see how people with a different set, a different background of information, how they react to what you're saying. And that's a very valuable thing, and I've treasured it all my life.
I'm so happy that you say about the fun and playing. As you know, in these affairs with the cultural programs we have been running, I generally used to quote a book we grew up with it, which was called the Homo Ludens, the playing man, by John Huizinga, and he explained in his book that the play element in the Western culture and civilization is the more important. And he says Homo sapiens, Homo faber, the tool-making man, fine, but the Homo Ludens, which really,
well, you may be right.
Which is really carries on, and everything which was really created in art, in science, both. And therefore we agreed, as you remember, that scientists are humanists, and the humanists should more about science. This artificial division is not very healthy.
Well, I think our field is the one in which it comes together naturally.
That's right.
More than almost any other.
That's right. And so after that, what is the next step?
Well, after that, when many people began to work on the parietal lobe around the world, and you know, when that happens, you sort of lose interest. They're going to do all that. So do something new. So I went back to the somatic afferent system. In the last 3 years, I've been working on a model which is of great interest to me. It's in the sense of flutter. And I taught animals and humans, we did psychophysics, to discriminate between frequencies of sine wave stimuli delivered to their fingers. Now you, with 1 day's training, can discriminate 1 or 2 cycles at the base of 30 cycles. Now the system is such that one can prove that the afferent input evoked by the 2 stimuli between which you seek to discriminate is occurring in the same set of fibers and the same sets of cortical neurons. Therefore, the discrimination cannot be made on the basis of a spatial shift in the neuronal population. It's got to be made on an interpretation of the dynamics of the neuronal discharge, and that's what interests me. So I've been working on that with considerable success, and my last problem, which I've just finished, and I stopped laboratory work last month, was on the motor cortex.
Changing from the sensory system.
There I found in the motor cortex of the opposite hemisphere, the motor hemisphere, a selective output of the discriminative operation, driving the hand to one or the other of 2 targets. Now, I haven't solved the discrimination operation which goes on in between, but I have discovered something which I think is dominating thinking in world neurophysiology at the moment. That is that we do not, at that level, deal with hierarchy. That complex operations like that are carried out in a distributed, multinodal and multi-interconnected system in the brain. That makes our task much more difficult, of course, because if the discrimination operation were occurring in area 3, we could get down on that and discover it, but it's not.
It's extraordinary how about the sensitivity of the system that you mentioned, and with the
extraordinarily sensitive. Now, the last thing that I developed technically was a technique for chronic implantation of many microelectrodes. And I think there's a tremendous future there. That is, I was able to implant 7. Well, if
It
not,
must be extremely complex, however, technically. No.
Well, anyway,
It can't be very easy.
if 7, why not 70? So one can imagine the experiment of the future in which there are implanted many microelectrodes, sufficiently large number to get a sample of a population, with all the signals broadcast, with the animal's behavior free, under control but free, so that now you induce him to emit natural behaviors as you observe the events in his brain. That
is the future.
Now it's very expensive. It's not very expensive when compared to molecular biology, but it's expensive compared to the seat-of-the-pants operation that most neurophysiologists have been engaged in my lifetime.
You mentioned that you are sort of giving up active experimentation, but what are your plans for the future? Writing something about parietal
I retire
lobe?
in June, and I will then be 74, and I'm occupying an office in our new Mind-Brain Institute at Homewood half-time. I hope to have some influence on the programs there, but my main objective is to write a series of monographs. And the first one is not on the parietal lobe. I want to write one on the intrinsic operations of the neocortex. Now, it's very good to choose a title about which nothing is known, you see.
That's right.
The truth is that we haven't the slightest idea of how any little region of gray matter does what it does. So I want to bring together all the evidence from physiology, from anatomy, from clinical work, to see what the possibilities are, what the options are. And I don't mean that I'll solve that problem, but I might help someone else to solve it.
Well, as we are always admired your productivity, we know from your curriculum vitae the enormous amount of publication, perhaps not as much as many other people, but the quality publication, and all your extraordinary effort with the Handbook of Physiology and all the chapters of the Handbook of Neurophysiology in successive editions. But I know that in addition to your remarkable scientific concentration, we are very proud of another role you played at Hopkins, because I do recall, even since I came, that practically any important committee where decisions had to be made to attract quality people, to do something for the future, you have been sitting on it, if not chairing on it. And if my recollection is correct, what is related to the present clinical neurosciences, which is the present situation, perhaps you can say a few words, how this developed in the three different areas.
I would like to.
You are imposed.
But first I'd like to say something else. When I became director of the Department of Physiology at Hopkins, there was a tremendous trust and mutual respect between directors of basic science and clinical departments. And an anecdote will illustrate it. Once I went to a meeting of the Association of Directors of Departments of Physiology, and several people were complaining how they were dominated and put down by their clinical departments. So I made a little speech saying that at Hopkins, at any rate, I would be very happy if the future of the Department of Physiology were put in the hands of the professor of medicine. And I meant it. They couldn't believe it. And it has always been true here that the heads of the very large and strong clinical departments have had a deep concern for the welfare of the basic science departments.
That's correct.
And I know that continues now. And I felt that very strongly when I became director of physiology. The people in the clinical departments wanted me to succeed. And I enjoyed that. And I enjoyed, well, I didn't enjoy all of it that went with it, but I did enjoy the opportunity to create new things. And the first new thing that I think I played an instrumental role in was the creation of a department of clinical neurology, which Hopkins had never had. It had outstanding neurologists. Matter of fact, when the committee started, I went to see Frank Ford. And I asked him about his career. He said, well, doctor, he always called everybody, well, doctor. He said, when I came back to Hopkins, I decided I could give Hopkins either neurology or a neurologist, and I chose the latter. That's what he said.
Yeah,
and he was right. That's what he did.
Want to administer everything.
That's right.
Yeah, that's right.
So Hopkins was very low in neurology, and the thing that finally convinced my colleagues that we had to do something, I looked up all the literature, and during the decade of the 1950s, of 10 classes, only one Hopkins graduate went into clinical neurology. When that fact came out, my colleagues in the clinical departments were simply bowled over. So we set about gathering the resources to create a department of neurology with Tommy Turner's leadership. And I won a bottle of champagne from Earl Walker. He bet that we could never get the advisory board to approve it, and we did, and I called him up, and in 10 minutes he came down the hall to my office with the champagne in his hand. That was fun. But we were lucky enough at that time to get 2 endowed chairs. You know, 2 endowed chairs virtually establishes a department. And we were lucky enough to get Dr. McCann and Dr. Johnson to come here at the same time. And since then, you know, the 20-year history of that department is non-Parietal. It's a tremendous department.
Yeah, very strong, very strong.
And
but then some other departments.
I think I played a role in creating the Department of Biomedical Engineering. It was then also a small subdivision of the Department of Medicine. And the proposition was put that perhaps we should do something. So Mac Harvey and I and Russ Morgan worked incessantly on that and finally established that department, and were lucky enough to get Dick Johns to direct it. And it has had about 20 years, and you've seen the recent reports labeling it the #1 department in the world in biomedical engineering. It's been a tremendous success, largely due to Dick's fantastic capacity for leadership. And more recently, the Department of Neuroscience developed, when I resigned from the directorship of the Department of Physiology, I pulled off what one would call three-cornered pool, namely that we would establish the Bard Laboratories of Neurophysiology, that we would create a department of neuroscience in which it would go, and incidentally that we would capture the Bard lectureship for the Department of Neuroscience. So I'm very proud of having played a role in those creation of those departments, which each of the 3 has been a tremendous success.
Yeah, Saul Schneider, who is
he's a fantastic leader. Saul Schneider is the best man with young people I've ever known. He attracts students like flies.
He's a tremendous number of postdoctoral fellows.
And he gives to them. He gives to them.
Yeah, he lets them
wonderful.
fly.
That's right.
Yeah. But it's wonderful to see that indeed, from these early beginnings, such a powerful clinical neuroscience department developed at Hopkins due to the farsightedness of many people, including yourself.
And the choice of good young people, which McCann has done. You have to give him that. So those are the things that I'm proud of, and the things that I enjoyed.
Yes. And, what do you think, before we go, something more personal, perhaps, which we will ask you a few questions, something where the future lies in neuroscience and where the future lies as Hopkins is concerned?
Well, neuroscience is in its glory. There are major problems. You see, the entry into neuroscience of molecular genetics and molecular biology has created a fantastic revolution and a new fund of knowledge which didn't exist even 10 years ago. And that's an extremely successful and attractive method and field of inquiry which is attracting all the very bright young people. It also, if you'll let me say so, is much easier than the study of systems neuroscience. So that people like myself and my colleagues working in systems neuroscience are now having some difficulty in attracting the best brains into our field. However, the future belongs to us. That the understanding of the brain as a brain is what is important. And Saul and I have had this discussion many times with my statement, Saul, if you know every transmitter and every receptor and every position of every molecule and how it changed, you still will not understand the brain. So it's systems neuroscience has a terrific future. And I think its future now will move much more toward the study of human beings than has been true in the past. Stimulated in part by the development of new imaging methods, although the imaging methods are essentially anatomical in nature, geographic in nature, they don't answer the basic physiological.
But it gives a different.
It does.
A different
so what I could see is a true amalgamation of that aspect of clinical neurology, of neuropsychology, is very important, of basic neurophysiology, and all of these fields coming together around questions. And I'm trying to persuade Edelman, for example, his institute is moving to the Scripps. I'm trying to persuade him to establish a laboratory of perception, not named neurophysiology or clinical neurology or modeling,
perception
but
from
around,
various angles.
around the problem.
Yes.
And I think that that's the sort of laboratory that will be successful in the future.
Yeah, well, I think the fact that we have a very strong basic neuroscience department and also a clinical neuroscience department where neurology, neurosurgery and psychiatry are together, and then finally the Brain-Mind Institute within the university.
We have tremendous opportunities.
It's an excellent opportunity. But Well, Vernon, we have been covering quite a lot about your scientific career and about your thought about it. Before we go over and talk about some more personal affairs of your life, I thought we should mention some of the few awards you have received, because indeed Hopkins is very proud. And I just would like to mention a few for the audience. The Lasker Award in 1983, the Lashley Prize for the American Philosophical Society in 74, the Sherrington Gold Medal from the Royal Society of Medicine in Great Britain in 77, the Horowitz Prize at Columbia University, the National Medal of Science, which was bestowed to you by the President of the United States in 86. And I know that you are very proud of the Thyssen Award, which is in France, and also you are a member of the Académie de Sciences in France. You even delivered a talk in French, I was told, which is a real effort. But in addition to that, I should mention that it's really nice for Hopkins and for neuroscience, all the degrees you received from places like University of Pennsylvania, the University of Zurich, the University of Siena, the University of Santiago de Compostela, worldwide recognition of your work. But perhaps you could say a few words about your work as editor-in-chief and editorial boards in general in science, because that is a very important impact nationwide and internationally.
Well, I would like to say something about how I got started in that, in writing a textbook. I was working on the cerebellum, and Elwood Henneman was in the department then working on the spinal cord. So Phil Bard asked me to write on the spinal cord and him to write on the cerebellum. And many people discouraged me from taking up the editorship and writing in the textbook of physiology, and I had there a most unique experience. I discovered that writing a textbook chapters on neurophysiology helped my research more than anything I ever did. And the reason is that if you have to encompass a field and write down the current state of knowledge in it, you have to understand it. So that from that moment on, I had greater strength in my research than I'd ever had before. I knew what I knew very well. Now, the handbooks are a different story. There you're putting together a compendium of knowledge for other investigators. And I think it's extremely important. And I worked very hard on the last edition of it, in which there are many volumes, as you know, with a separate volume editor for each one, with whom I worked. And I enjoyed that, and I learned a lot. And I'd like to point out that the most interesting experience I had was with Fred Plum, who was the editor of the Higher Functions volumes, and I was his editor-in-chief. He really is a scholar. You know, he educated himself over those 2 or 3 years in a way that was unbelievable. And his reviews of chapters were classical, page after page of detailed criticism and instruction to the writers. And I learned a lot from that. In general, I think that I enjoy, as much as I do experiments, equally I enjoy encompassing a subject, to know everything, or as much as you can, about that subject. That is a tremendous feeling of satisfaction. And that's what I got from doing that sort of work. Editing a journal I found to be much less stimulating. That's important. Somebody has to do it. I think there are several papers by Japanese authors in the Journal of Neurophysiology that I wrote or rewrote, but that helped them, it helped the journal.
That's right.
And when I took over the journal, it was at a low point, and it came back, and now I think it's one of the most distinguished journals in neuroscience, the Journal of Neurophysiology.
It must have been extremely hard work.
But I think that writing a summary of a subject is something that every scientist ought to do at some time, because you really, you have to bite the bullet. To say what you think the truth is about the subject and to summarize the state of knowledge. So I don't regret the many, many long hours, midnight oil hours doing that sort of thing. You know what that's like.
Yeah.
And I don't think it ever compromised my research. Nor do I think that teaching compromises one's research. Teaching at any level, and I enjoyed mainly the interactions I had with senior postdoctoral fellows, is the most stimulating thing a research man can do.
Yeah. Of course, you established a wonderful laboratory. The complexity of your laboratory and the facilities they are there must be very attractive for all the people who want to come to work.
I think so. It was, and I hope it will continue in the future. Dr. Steinmetz is inheriting my laboratory, and I'm sure he'll develop it to far better.
Yes. Well, as we discussed before, we mentioned that when I grew up, how much we like the book of MacDonald Critchley about the parietal lobe, which was an exciting book, like a storybook really. And I think it's high time that somebody should put together something similar, including all the results of the basic research has been done. And maybe that you will think of it and on that one and put something
if there are enough years,
on the map, which is really supplement and have the continuation of this.
But perhaps one could combine that with a monograph on the study of higher functions, including the parietal. That would be a gargantuan effort, but it would be worth doing.
Well, now I think we have to pass a little over all the scientific and administrative duties you had in your lifetime here at Hopkins and talk about the private man a little bit, of yourself, about your hobbies. And I know that you love gardening, and I know from my spies that you love very much horse riding.
Yes.
Can you say a few things what recreational
on the personal side, my greatest accomplishment in life, of course, was to persuade Nancy Pierpont to share it with me.
That's correct.
We've had a long and extremely happy marriage and wonderful children, and we now have 6 grandchildren. We had previously lived in the country in the decade of the 70s and had our own horses there, and we decided 2 years ago to create a place that would attract grandchildren, teenage grandchildren. So we moved to the country, and we have there a swimming pool and 12 acres and 4 horses, and our grandchildren are there all the time. I enjoy many sports. I'm an outdoorsman, tennis and horseback riding mainly, but I think that the greatest feeling of freedom that one can have, of joy, would be on a horse you love. You must love your horse, as he loves you. But to be riding a horse through the trail in the forest in the fall with a little snow on the ground, that's as close to paradise as one can hope to get.
Yeah.
At least I enjoy it. And we live in a place where we can ride very freely.
Yes, a lovely place you have.
And my wife is a better rider than I am. She enjoys it. She's excellent. And I play tennis twice a week with my colleagues in neurology and in radiology. I enjoy very much playing people younger than I am and sometimes beating them.
Challenge.
That's a great joy. That's a great challenge, yes. But tennis is a marvelous sport because one can work out all of one's anger and frustration without harming anyone.
That's right.
It's very nice for that reason.
Yeah, I understand you have a very good team from neuroscience.
We have a pretty good group, yes. I think that to get the residency in clinical neurology, you have to first be a good tennis player. So those are the things that I do and that I expect to do in the future as I dwindle down towards the end of life, to enjoy my grandchildren and to enjoy sports. And
but I remember you enjoyed also pleasant conversation. I remember our times in the little club we used to go and relax and have some good stories, which is very important.
I enjoy that tremendously.
Very important.
And I maintain my contacts at my college. I was there just 2 weeks ago at a reunion, and I enjoy seeing people I grew up with. There's a very interesting thing about it, and you must have had the same experience when you go home. To see someone that you knew well 50 years ago is an extraordinary experience. It's as if time had disappeared.
Yeah.
Suddenly, it's just like it was. Isn't that an interesting experience?
Well, don't you think that is the whole concept of time? It's so important. Many great writers try to solve these problems, that certain moments in your life which is directly related to another moment much later, and you can sit with somebody together and time doesn't make any sense, and you walk in after 5 or 10 years and everything is back again.
That's a very
continuity
interesting
there suddenly.
I think that type of experience must be restricted to one's youth. Have you had the same experience when you meet new people in middle age?
Yeah.
I haven't. Mine is mainly with people I knew
very few.
When I was below 20.
Very few, correct.
And I grew up with a marvelous group of boys. There were 12 boys within 2 blocks of my house. And we grew up together and did everything together, did sports together. And the families of those boys were like aunts and uncles to me.
And you see that
their homes, their homes were open. It was just one great big family, and it was a very extraordinary place and extraordinary time to grow up. The period of the Depression was very severe, but it also produced a certain empathy between people, I think, that was almost unique, at least in America. And I profited greatly from that.
And you go back to Virginia occasionally?
I go several times a year.
Yeah.
I have family there, and I'm. You know the old joke that one must never tell anyone you're a Virginian because the other person will be embarrassed that he's not.
Yeah, that's remember Horsley Gant who said Day University. There was no doubt that Day
right.
University was.
Wasn't he a wonderful man? Horsley Gant is one of the unique people in the history of Hopkins.
Well, we had this. We mentioned briefly a few of them that they have been characters, unforgettable characters.
Yes.
Kurt Richter.
Yes.
And Horsley Gant, or Frank Ford you mentioned already, or Frank Walsh who came later on the scene. Extraordinary.
People like that have an extraordinary influence that they themselves may not perceive. It's an individual influence, not teaching a class. But look at all the young people that worked in Kurt Richter's lab. Everyone regards that now as been a tremendous experience for him.
Extraordinary, yeah.
And Horsley was a man who he had unique ideas. He would suddenly come to me with an idea that was out from left field. You know.
Yeah, well.
Interesting ideas.
And always curiosity.
Yeah, that's right.
Always new things. And when you ask why you are doing that, it was interesting.
That's right. Once I saw him when he was about 80, and he talked about athletics. He said, Vernon, he said, I've got to get back in shape.
Well, I'm not sure it is very in the framework of this interview, but why won't we mention it? Because he had trigeminal neuralgia, you remember? And he said, you know, when I am breaking the ice and swim in the winter, you know, it hits me. I said, Horsley, can't you perhaps refuse the temptation to swim under breaking the ice? And then he said he conditions himself against pain. It can be done, and he did. He refused any surgical intervention. And
there's something else about Hopkins that I will say just as we're closing, which I think is not unique. It probably is true at a few other schools. Hopkins is a very conceited place. We all get the impression that we're pretty good, but that has a positive effect on a young man, at least when I came here, the feeling that you were becoming part of something that's good and important, and you had to live up to it.
Correct.
And that people expected it of you. And that internal mystique about our institution, I think, has an important role to play in the development of young people.
But on the other hand, my impression was, what you mentioned also, this extraordinary atmosphere that the so-called very famous people talk to you.
Absolutely.
Communicated to you, were part of it. I never forget, as a little fellow when I arrived and went to the doctor's dining room, which those days on the right side of the dining room, as you remember, and there was sitting Dr. Blaylock and Dr. Walsh and all these people, and you were accepted, and you could ask questions. And I quite often was asked, what is the difference in the last 35 odd years? The difference is that in those days the discussion was about ideas. Now the discussion is more about money.
Money, yes.
And about problems.
Well, I forgot to tell you something about Earl Walker.
Yeah.
I spent a month as his fellow, and that meant that I went around with him to see all of his patients. And I learned something about a neurosurgeon then that I had previously not known. Earl Walker was a great clinical neurologist.
Oh, wonderful.
And very conservative in his choice of whether or not to do surgery. I was impressed with that.
Oh, Dr. Walker was interviewed in this series by me, and it was very difficult to bring out from him the extraordinary capacities he had. He was the only good neurologist for a while.
I thought that in his time here, he was the man with the broadest knowledge in neurological sciences of anyone.
And as you remember, it was so nice to have him back a few days ago when we had this memory symposium. Here he was at the age of 85, giving the first introductory lecture about the history of memory, and he traced it back, you remember, in the old days, and kept it up, which shows the extraordinary brain power what he had.
Well, we're lucky to have been in this community.
Well, it was a great fun, and knowing you, and we are all very happy that you were with us, and we hope that you will stay with us with your ideas and with your influence, which was so important, namely absolute intellectual honesty. And the scientific methods, even in human exchange, which I think is very important for the young people, for an institution, and for the world we are living in. It was a real pleasure to have you with us.
You're very kind.